8 Golden Age stars were destroyed by drugs. The child who died on the floor of a dirty apartment. Her body discovered only when her dog started eating her flesh. The boy who'd been abandoned in an abandoned building, literally interred as a John Doe, a forgotten child, for over a year. The woman who never saw 41. The man who'd been 40 when he died, but appeared 60. This is not a list of tragedy. This is a list of a system that worked exactly as intended. Behind the glittering fillies of Hollywood's golden age, a machine hummed that didn't merely discover stars. It produced them, used them, and destroyed them. The pills that fueled that machine weren't random. They were intentional instruments of control. The pills weren't fun. They were necessary, a necessary part of the job, admitted a studio doctor who practiced throughout the 1950s. Amphetamines to keep them working 18-hour shifts, barbituritis to calm them enough to take the call when they became dependent. The studios feigned shock as though they hadn't engineered that dependency themselves. The game plan worked with laudable efficiency. Find stars, dope them to keep them working idiot hours, cast them aside once they become highs when they wanted to film, directing the cameras on themselves once more with shocked dismay, as if they'd been merely a frail, fragile flower, ruined by itself, of course. It's not merely the bodies that are what make these stories particularly disturbing. It's that the same people who administered a 13-year-old girl her first amphetamines would blacklist her later for the addiction they caused, who employed doctors to dish them pills, but later expressed pretended dismay when they'd failed to control themselves. This is not merely celebrity dirt. It's proof that a certain industry, rich as can be, has been predicated on destruction on the very cells of the people who'd made them rich. We're going to look at 10 of the most disturbing cases of a certain use of pills, a use that destroyed stars, a use that destroyed people in Hollywood's golden age. But we're going to begin, as we should, with one who has been the most tragical of all, the child who'd begun as Disney's golden boy to die alone on a dirty mattress, his body unmourned, his identity forgotten by the very people who'd lionize him. But he's mine. I've been given him by my sister, Jenny. What your mom gonna say when you come home with that dog? She ain't gonna let you have nobody mean. Bobby Driscoll, Disney's throwaway child. Disney analyst Maricela Herrera wrote of him back in 1970. When Walt Disney wanted a real boy to anchor his fledgling live-action productions, he chose Bobby Driscoll. Disney's child star, with his expressive eyes and effortless charisma, brought light joy and a sense of moral rectitude to Disney's animated shorts. Then he grew up, and Disney dumped him with the garbage. Disney didn't simply fire him when he matured enough for his own face, not Disney's, to be a problem, said a Disney historian who agreed to speak on condition of anonymity. They blacklisted him. Tell other producers he's a problem. The same people who worked him 60 hours a week when he was a kid treated him as useful, now saw he never worked again. You're essentially giving kids a message that they are not wanted, that they are irrelevant, said a Disney spokesperson when contacted for this story. The psychological trauma happened quickly. The most special child in America 1 minute, garbage the next. Driscoll, who had never been the one with the problem, said a friend, had never really thought of himself as a problem child to begin with, suddenly scaled the wall of popularity to find himself poked fun at by his high school classmates because they're jealous of his success from Peter Pan. Then his face changed, his self-confidence destroyed. Barbara Bennett, a child star from a different era, told a newspaper reporter of what happened to Boy. By the age of 17, he'd started taking whatever you find, said a friend. He started with drink, ended with heroin. Disney taught me to use drugs, he told a friend a short while before he died. He'd been taking pharmaceuticals to stay alert, to sleep, even when he didn't feel tired, said a friend. He'd use them even when he didn't have a reason, that he'd use them even when he didn't need them, he continued. He said Disney gave him when he still had a tooth in his head. Driscoll's life in his early 20s is a jagged line of arrest for possession of drugs, feeble attempt at a comeback, desperate attempts to escape. What a child star is when he's no longer childlike enough anymore. Then in '68, kids playing in a vacant tenement in the East Village of New York stumbled upon a body on a cot, lined with Bibles, empty beer cans, and a layer of government-issue blankets, wrote a writer for a New York magazine. Without identification, with a face that didn't resemble his youthful, recognizably famous profile. The man received a John Doe burial in a pauper's grave on Hart's Island. It would take a full year before his fingerprints led to the identity of Hollywood's golden boy. Disney's golden boy is how he is described. This golden boy died alone, broke, and forgotten in the summary assessment of the biographer. The most heartbreaking thing is that the boy who played Peter Pan, who never grew up on screen, grew too old too quickly from his excesses, wrote Driscoll's biographer. Driscoll, at age 31, was already dead. The company that put his face on lunchboxes and comic books never even noticed his passing. And my eyesight is so bad that it's becoming hard to read the eyes of the CC. Garland's theme is continued. Judy Garland, MGM's chemical casualty. The most vile part of Judy Garland's tale is not that she overdosed on barbiturates. It is that she started taking pills because studio chiefs forced her to take them when she was only 13. The pills were amphetamines administered by MGM doctors with her mother watching, according to a former employee who lives with the daily effects of what she saw at MGM. They called them pep pills, she said, and they told a child that's what they were. Then, when she got hungry, she'd get appetite suppressors. When she couldn't sleep from all the uppers she'd been taking, she'd get barbiturates, she said. This isn't what most people would consider occasional use. It is, in fact, what can best be described as a chemical management of the child's natural physiology to keep the child's body on a regular enough schedule to film The Wizard of Oz, which at this age, Garland is still filming. At age 16, Garland is heavily dependent on the up-down chemical rush, which she didn't seek, which she didn't want, but which she physically can't avoid, though she doesn't even now really understand what is happening. What is happening to her, wrote Garland's biographer. The studio chief, MGM's Louis B. Mayer, his representatives, controlled her intake, supervised her weight, controlled every aspect of the girl's developing body with pharmaceuticals. He supplied her with pills to wake her up, pills to go to sleep with, pills to eat, pills not to eat, her biographer wrote. Then he lectures her on self-discipline when she can't function on what he himself has made her physiologically dependent on, her own chemicals. The most tragic part, though, is the death certificate itself, that of Garland. It says singer and actress, as if she had not been victim of studio chemical management all along. When MGM finally dumped her in 1950 after 15 years of chemical manipulation, they didn't send her to rehab, said an addiction expert who has investigated Garland's situation. They didn't take responsibility for her addiction. Instead, they said she was difficult and unreliable, code words in the industry for an addict they'd made but no longer wished to manage. The Hollywood establishment handed her the pills, but when they worked exactly as planned, they blamed her, said the expert. She was a reminder of celebrity indulgence. She was a consciously produced addict who never once consented to the dependency that led to her death. Garland died alone in a London bathroom she'd rented, her body found by her fifth husband. Garland was 47, but she appeared to be 67. Her body had been reduced decades by the chemical treatment that started when she'd been playing with dolls. The studio bosses who'd initially pushed pills into her burgeoning hands all predeceased her. "Where are you going?" "I am going to drop you off at your house," he said. "Where are you going?" "I am going with you," he said. Gail Russell, Paramount's fearful beauty. Some stars turn to drugs for recreation, said a biographer of Golden Age actresses. Gail Russell turned to drink for survival, because that's the only way she could confront that camera that so terrified her, said the expert on Golden Age actresses. Paramount saw a pretty face, handed her a microphone, and sent her in front of the camera with not a single acting lesson, not a single minute of preparation, said Golden Age actress biographer. Russell was pathologically shy, shaking with stage fright so bad she'd vomit beforehand. Instead of putting her in a prep class, they told her to drink, said Golden Age biographer. This was no subtle suggestion, said Golden Age biographer. Her debilitating fright of the camera is so obvious that the cameraman started doling her a drink beforehand, said Golden Age biographer. The studio system didn't want to hear a lot of psychobabble. Alcohol worked faster, cheaper, and better to get the darn footage shot. "Take the edge off," they told a fearful girl. "Drink a little, girl, to calm your nerves," said Golden Age biographer. Just a few of these drinks led to a dependence so acute that she, one of Hollywood's most ethereal beauties, was reduced to a bloated, shaking ruin in a matter of a few short years. This drinking, which had begun as a studio-sanctioned way to cope with her situation, quickly led to full-blown alcoholism, rendering the star less and less employable by the hour. The most tragic element, Russell never wanted to be an actress to begin with. It was Paramount's talent scouts who spotted her when she attended art school, which was where her true interest lay. The studio system chose a woman with a face that bordered on the extraordinary, forced her into a line of work that filled her with profound dread, and pharmacologically managed that dread with a compound that would ultimately kill her. Drinking became a matter of living, but it killed her far faster than the fame, a studio executive who worked with Russell when she was a chemical presence saw. The studio offered a girl who had never been trained, but who was suffering from pathologically low nervous tension, the choice of either drink or fail. They ended up dumping her when the drinking made her unhireable. Russell died alone in her apartment in 1961, surrounded by empty glasses, but her body didn't remain undiscovered for weeks. Cruel as it seemed, the death certificate attributed her death to alcohol, with no need to detail the industry that initially introduced the bottle to her. I am glad to be here today. Thank you. And Montgomery Clift, a smash-up on a California curve involving a telephone pole in 1956. Montgomery Clift, a talented screen presence who many regarded as Marlon Brando's only real rival, a sensitive leading man whose depth of acting, feeling, and pleasing, hawk-like good looks had redefined American masculinity on screen. His car crashed around a telephone pole on a winding California highway. Clift survived the accident, but the Montgomery Clift who came back from reconstructive surgery a different man, his face changed, his dignity bruised, his handling of pain medication about to throw his life into ruin. Clift, his friend said, didn't feel pain. He'd never feel again. Pause. He had a complete existential crisis. Half his ego had been invested in being the most beautiful man in movies. Now, looking in the mirror, he saw a different face, and it hurt all the time. Came a pharmaceutical nightmare that would now be identified as iatrogenic addiction. The doctors fostered dependence that bordered on overprescription. Different doctors prescribed him similar analgesics. No one challenged the cocktails or the doses. Clift, in torment from his agony, followed the doctor's prescription with a healthy dose of alcohol chaser. He did what the doctors said, and when that didn't work, he did what they said even more, said the biographer. The pills in his house lined the shelves of a pharmacy, bottles upon bottles from different doctors who never communicated with one another. The changes came quickly. In the 3 short years that followed his accident, the most reliable, most prepared of actors who star within Hollywood's top winners roster now can't even memorize his own lines. He shook with his hands, slurred his words, said a friend. Insurance companies demanded special bonding for actors who signed him for a picture. That naturally made the producers leery, as talented as he was, because he cost extra. You saw the incredible Clift, mindlessly taking his 15 pills a day, reach your terrible end from a pharmacy that supplied him with his medications, while making his real life, his acting life, his existence inconsequential. The directors who praised his extraordinary talent worked around his increasing unpredictability with sophisticated systems that allowed him to complete his part of filming in the morning hours, with body doubles when he was far off in the background, filming safely when he's filming his close-up with a single take, saving his worst moments for what came later, when he assembled his film, when editing. He was a wonderful, creative, talented, bright, cheerful, gay, hateful, depraved, weakened, deranged, defeated, disappeared, damned in hell angel, overcome by his pains, by his pills, which overshadowed all, said a director who worked with Clift in his later years. What is the tragedy of his accident that changed his look, changed his mind, said a director who worked with Clift when he was still a star. It's a tragedy that a decade of pharmaceutical onslaught following his accident destroyed his mind. On the 23rd of July, 1966, Clift's private nurse discovered him dead in his New York bedchamber. The official reason for his death is a heart attack, though he really killed himself with a decade-long pharmaceutical onslaught on his body. The insidious cocktail of his increased doses of prescription medications, intermixed with a generous chaser of alcohol, which had degraded his heart irreparably until that ultimate failure, a heart attack that killed him suddenly when he was merely 45 years of age. The medications he had in his home, all of which were prescribed, numbered over 30. Baloney, and then how, God, that's enough. Bela Lugosi, Dracula's real-life nightmare. The brutal irony of Bela Lugosi's life is that the man who brought immortality to the screen would be brought low by his own attempts to cope with his very mortal suffering. Everyone remembers him as Dracula, but nobody talks about why he became morphine addicted, said a film historian who specializes in horror movies. It wasn't a habit. The man had terrible chronic problems with sciatica from his physical acting style. In the 1930s, opium was the only thing that worked. It started as a problem of taking more of the stuff because of tolerance built, but he had a problem that he didn't want to have, a problem that he didn't know he had, that he'd have to live with the rest of his life, because he'd been a serious physical actor, had serious physical problems, but he'd been a serious addiction problem. The need for more medication came at a bad time, because his acting career was going nowhere. The Hungarian accent that he had, that worked so well in Dracula, limited his acting options as the horror movie genre changed, because he'd never been a Gothic-style monster. He'd been a Gothic-style monster, but he'd never been a Gothic-style monster who'd been a modern monster. He'd been a monster who'd been a monster, but he'd been a monster of the Gothic era. But he'd been a monster who'd been a monster, but he'd been a monster who'd been a Gothic monster, but he'd been a monster who'd been a monster who'd been a monster. He'd been a monster who'd 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 been a Gothic monster. This is what he'd been. But he'd been a monster who'd 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 been a Gothic monster, he said. He'd been a monster who'd 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 been a monster. He checked into a rehab center, speaking publicly about his problems in the hopes that he might rehabilitate himself, as well as reduce the stigma against addiction treatment. The methods used in addiction treatment in his era are considered primitive by today's standards. Although Lugosi was able to maintain periods of sobriety, he never treated his chronic problem of pain. It is evident that, lacking alternative methods of pain control, he inevitably succumbed to relapse. He died in 1956 at the age of 73, financially destroyed despite having created one of Hollywood's most beloved characters. The chasm existing between his cultural importance and his private life is enormous. In a cruel finale that epitomized his own acting career, Lugosi was interred wearing one of his Dracula capes from his acting career, permanently associating him with a product that launched his acting success, as he was reduced to typecasting because of his own addiction difficulties with chronic pain. The doctors who prescribed him his medicines for so long, with such cavalier attention to the need for close observation alongside alternative treatment options, failed to attend his funeral, as they also failed to take charge of addiction treatment that might have precluded developing similar patients in the future. I really haven't had a chance in a long time to come as close as I am now to his heart. Dina Barbara Payton, Hollywood's fastest fall. Barbara Payton's fall from grace remains one of Hollywood's fastest and most brutal, wrote her biographer, John O'Dow. Drugs and alcohol not only killed her career, but destroyed her entire identity. Indeed, Payton's breakthrough film in the 1950s starred her in Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye with James Cagney, a performance that seemed to show a great deal of promise. Barbara Payton's platinum blonde hair, lovely face, and voluptuous figure were all the things the movie studios were hawking when she broke into the scene with such promise in the early 1950s. However, Payton's acting career quickly derailed as a result of a torrid love affair with actors Franchot Tone, who she met on location, and Tom Neal, which quickly led to enough scandal that Neal ended up putting Tone in the hospital with a serious beating. Although the scandal led to a negative impact on Tone's acting future, Payton's acting career ended with her failure, reflecting the societal pressures confronting actresses of that era. A female star with a connection to violence, even as a secondary factor, became unsellable. This rejection as a professional exacerbated Payton's already existing tendency towards substance abuse. Turning down legitimate acting gigs, she started to use alcohol, barbiturates, and later heroin, not only for recreation, but also as a means of pharmacological realignment for her. Depression and anxiety over her faltering acting career. She used it all. Pills, booze, later heroin, explained a friend who knew Payton during this ordeal. She wasn't partying. She was taking chemicals for her depression, her anxiety over her crumbling career. She used it all. The physical changes came shockingly fast. In 1951, Payton posed for photographers as a beautiful blonde starlet. In 1956, she appeared 2 decades older, swollen, disheveled, with a face once considered perfect now ravaged by substance abuse and hard living. As Payton's addiction grew, so did her poverty, wrote her biographer. Without a support structure and an industry that had abandoned her entirely, Payton made a horrifying switch. Warner Brothers contract starred to a prostitute on Sunset Boulevard in less than a decade. She was hustling on the same streets where her movies played at cinematic theaters a short while before. Her biographer wrote, "Customers of John sometimes recognized her from her pictures, making strange encounters that further fueled her use of chemicals to block the hurts," wrote Payton's biographer. The geometric path to her destruction was precise, observed a film historian who has extensively researched the use of chemicals in Hollywood, particularly with regard to the universe that Payton inhabited. Drugs, alcohol, made her unsaleable. Unsaleability brought financial desperation. Desperation led to prostitution. Psychological trauma from prostitution fed a need for increased indulgence in chemicals. The effect fed back on itself, mutually intensifying, a zero-sum game of demolition. Payton's life ended when she was 39, destroyed by the effect of a life of substance abuse, a liver, a heart, a diet that had been ruined by all that she subjected it to. The autopsy revealed a system that looked a quarter of a century older than Payton, a quarter of a century. Her obituary in the New York Times, 2 sentences long. "I would not have taken Errol Flynn, the swashbuckler who poisoned himself," Payton said toward the end of her life. "My biographer has written, he didn't simply portray danger on screen." A film historian wryly commented on Payton's observation. He line-driven that danger straight into his veins. Alcohol, heroin, cocaine, barbiturates, a historian continuing his research on the chemistry that he has documented on Errol Flynn's chemical use, which he notes, often involved a series of chemicals, all taken in one day sometimes, he wrote. Mixed together, his body became a pharmacy war zone, with various medications engaged in a struggle for supremacy as his internal organs were compelled to pay a brutal toll. It is not merely the nature of his use that made Flynn an interesting exception, but how this use directly conflicted with his public persona on screen. In his Robin Hood and Captain Blood roles, he represented physically vigorous, athletic men. In real life, he led a deliberate campaign to destroy the very body that had launched his success. He didn't discriminate in his use. His biographer said, "Uppers in the morning to get him going, alcohol throughout the day, cocaine to keep him alert, heroin or barbiturates to bring him down. His daily dosage would have killed a normal man, but his tolerance was such that it became the stuff of legend, until it stopped him altogether." The change in his appearance reflected the progress of his addictions. The swashbuckling leading man of the 1930s gradually transformed via the puffy, twitching addict he'd become of the 1950s. This once athletic figure's body expanded, his once handsome face ballooned. His renowned endurance dwindled to the point that his body doubles had to take on most of his physical activity in his later movies. In his 40s, Flynn found that he had trouble making it up a flight of stairs without becoming short-winded. A filmmaker who worked with him later on has said, "He had such bad hands that he couldn't do close-ups with his hands, so he'd use another fellow's hands," he added. He'd been a real stuntman, a real fighter on screen, but it was virtually impossible for him to even climb a ladder. The The professional consequence of Flynn's addiction has been obvious. Insurance companies demanded performance bonds on his picture. Directors work hard to find creative solutions to his problem, shooting his scenes when he was still sober enough, with doubles when necessary, and designing sequences that allowed him to sit still. The most unfortunate thing, though, is that his use of addictive behavior is no longer hidden, but has actually been part of his image. He's been a hard adventure movie star, but he's been living on screen. His biographer has said he's been living on his notorious drinking. How can he get cured when his most marked characteristic has been his notorious drinking? Flynn passed on in Vancouver in 1959, reportedly overdosing while attempting to raise money by trying to sell his yacht because of massive debts. The official reason for his death was heart attack and failure of his circulatory system, but the actual reason is that he has been bombarding his cardiovascular system with chemicals for 2 decades. This happened when he was merely 50. The pathologist's actual quote said that Flynn had the body of a 70-year-old, with every major organ suffering from the effects of decades-long abuse of chemicals. He lived hard and died much too young, his biographer once said. The chemicals that started him off as a living hardman ended up wiping his image clean from existence, thus becoming a reminder that Hollywood never seems to learn from. The hard celebrity who begins his pharmaceutical escapades with adventures that make headlines that are really fascinating, but end up destroying that very image which made him a marking success in the first instance.